All right, everybody, let's get started. I'll keep an eye on things as people trickle in. And welcome to tonight's episode of Talk, Taste, and Travel. This week, we are off to the countries of Georgia and Armenia. My name is Kristen Sandvig. I'm the founder of local travel agency Lionhound Travel, and I have Adele Corrigan, the general manager of 13 Celsius, with me here tonight as well. And we are excited for a couple of special guests who are joining us this evening, and we'll introduce them in just a little bit. But before I pass it off to Adele, I do want to take a moment just to thank you for this episode's producers. This would not be possible without you guys. And I also want to thank our producers who choose to remain anonymous. We see you and we're grateful for you, and we look forward to having you with us every week. Adele, why don't you hop on and just introduce yourself to everybody? And I think you have some exciting updates to share about what's going on at 13.
Hi. How's everyone doing? I'm Adele, and then I've got my friend who's also going to be one of our guest Psalms for this week, Chris here. We're going to be drinking some wine and hanging out together for today. But I do have some very exciting news. I alluded to this last week, but we did receive TABC's permission to reopen full service at 13. So you can now come on by and have a glass of wine while you pick up your wines for the next week, or we might be able to do some really cool events that Kristen and I were kind of brainstorming. Maybe we'll do like a live version of Talk, Taste, and Travel. But whatever the reason is to come by, you can now officially come by.
And with that, let's get started tonight. Like I said, this evening we are off to the Caucasus, and our first stop today takes us to the country of Georgia. 200 years of generally unfriendly attention from Russia would be enough to put most countries in a conformist mood, but not Georgia. This country is located just south of the high Caucasus Mountains, and it sits between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it has historically served as an important bridge between Europe and Asia. And Georgians have formed an extraordinary sense of national identity, and they are repeatedly ready to stand their ground when it comes to the interests of their neighbors. And a powerful part of that identity is their claim to the invention of wine. After we visit Georgia, we will head down to Armenia this evening, which is sandwiched between Georgia, Turkey, Iran, and Azerbaijan. And this is a small and mountainous country that's full of opportunities to discover when it comes to both travel and to wine. The stunning landscapes, delicious food, and the warm, welcoming people really delight any traveler that's visiting. And it has roots that trace back as far as the Hittites, and it has been conquered by almost every great empire in Eurasia. So it has a really unique cultural history. Adele, tell us a little bit more about the history of both of these countries and what we can expect today as we travel through them.
Sure, yeah, fun facts. We have all of these really cool countries that kind of are nestled in the birthplace of wine. And this is what archaeologically archaeologists
there we go.
have discovered as basically being like the oldest winemaking places, residue from grapes in jars, along with just like other evidence that grapes were domesticated, all in this one area of the world. And all of this sort of dates back to like 8,000 BC, a really, really long time ago. This is definitely one of like the oldest wine regions that we've talked about throughout this entire series. I know that at sometimes we've talked about like the oldest vineyards in Europe and all over the world, but today we're actually going to the home of where grapes officially came from. They used to make really, really good wines, and it's fun to see a little bit of a resurgence now in the market of some really cool wines that have kind of come our way from Georgia and also Armenia. Anything you want to add on that one, if you want?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the wines coming out of Georgia and Armenia. I am Armenian, and my family has always been very proud of Armenia's wine heritage. As studies have shown, the oldest winery in the world was found in a cave within Armenia. I think we've got some photos to share of that cave, but it's really unique. It's an amazing country, rich in history, and we're excited to share that with everyone today.
Yeah, but all these countries didn't always used to be really good friends with each other. They were pretty much each other's best enemy, if you will. These countries, they might be right next to each other, but between different wars in as recently as the 90s, I mean, it still causes political turmoil between these countries, not to mention the fact that, Russia and the USSR and the Cold War, which we definitely hit upon last week when we were talking about Slovenia and Serbia, the same thing happened here. I mean, Armenia itself was designated as a brandy producing nation, which basically wiped out their whole winemaking for quality. And instead they were encouraged to produce brandy with, very poor quality grapes. So although they have like a super long history of great winemaking, it was very stunted by that, the Iron Curtain and all those angry Russians.
I think one thing that is super exciting for me personally today about us visiting this region, if you will, is how Georgia's a country that growing up, I didn't know what it was. I'd never really heard of it. And for whatever reason, it seems to just kind of follow me through my life. I spent time in the Caucasus back in 2008. That was my first visit to that area. And then Adele, you and I, Adele participates in Iron Sommelier every year, and I've always been her assistant for it. And we did Georgian wine as our theme a few years ago. And now with it kind of becoming a little bit more up and coming as a travel destination, it's exciting to see just how interest in this country has changed over time and just what the future holds for it. So with that, I wanted to share this quotation with you guys from the one and only John Steinbeck. And they spoke of Georgians as supermen, as great drinkers, great dancers, great musicians, great workers, and lovers. And they spoke of the country in the Caucasus and around the Black Sea as a kind of second heaven. And I thought that was a perfect introduction to this really beautiful, really undiscovered country. And as I said, it does stand at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, with one foot rooted in its historical past and another pointing towards its promising future. There are valleys, vineyards, rivers, and the country is home to some of the most spectacular landscapes in the Caucasus. Georgians are equally beautiful people, and they're proud and highly spirited, as history has shown time and time again. The capital city is a cultural melting pot, and in the 20th century, it was populated by international artists and intellectuals. The eclectic nature varies from Ottoman-inspired hot baths to jaw-dropping examples of Art Nouveau, and the delicate and crooked buildings built into the rock with intricately decorated balconies make an impression on any and every visitor. Art, architecture, music, and cuisine are all distinctive threads of Georgian culture, and we're super excited to really dive into it today with you guys and show you a little bit more. A visit to Georgia is truly a sensory experience, and there's no doubt that this is the capital of food in the Caucasus region. And joining as a guest at a local feast is considered a blessing by the Georgians, and they use plenty local fresh produce that's locally grown, sourced ingredients, walnuts, pomegranates, smoked cheese, and we'll get into that a little bit more later in this episode. And wash it down with some Georgian wines produced in totally natural large clay urns that are called amphora. And that's the perfect ending to any meal while you're visiting this area. So with that, Adele, take us give us a little intro into today's wines, and let's open our first one and get started.
Yeah,
That's
so
who
these
said
are,
you were Armenian.
oh, what? Okay, well, here's the 3 wines for today. Those of you guys who picked up your 9 wine pack, make sure you have these 3 out. We're gonna start with the Dilao, and that is our orange wine. And then after that, we're gonna get into the Orgo. And then third, we're gonna talk about the Zora. So this week we are gonna be going in order of lighter to heavier versus last week when we did everything in reverse. So here we are in Georgia, and if you're gonna visit, something that's interesting is that the northern part of Georgia, the border with Russia, is constantly changing, kind of depending on like which political powers are happening. So they constantly have this like revolving border, but the mountains basically provide like a pretty steady border, and the majority of the winemaking regions are scattered throughout, but definitely the most important is the region of Kakheti, and that one is in the more southern and eastern part. Again, as we mentioned before, that Georgia has very old winemaking traditions that date back, and we'll get into the specifics of a couple of those and be able to taste a few really cool examples. Within Georgia, there's 10 wine regions and over 500 different indigenous grapes. That is a lot of grapes to learn. So therefore, the government and everyone else has kind of narrowed down 37 different grapes, and those are sort of authorized varieties to be planted in certain areas and then labeled as such. But of course, just like anyone who's learning anything about wine, and even like Italian wines, they don't put the grape necessarily on the front label, they put the region. So it's like you have to memorize all of these different regions in Georgian and then know what grape corresponds to those. Very difficult. Thank goodness Google is around. But if there's 2 grapes that you are to know, it would be as if Napa's Cab and Chardonnay. These are the 2 grapes. Their red is called Samparave and their white is Ricottone. And we're going to try an example of each of those today. Very, very excited about those ones.
That's super exciting. And tell us a little bit about what really stands out about Georgian wine tonight, as far as like the production and the color and things like that.
Anywhere that you go, if you're going to taste wines from Georgia, you're going to find 2 different styles. There's going to be one that's made in the traditional style, which is aged in the kivri, which are these pots pictured on the screen. You can see these like large earthen clay. And then another style is going to be like the modern style, which is how we know wine made today. But to me, I think the more interesting styles are definitely the ones that are made in like the old school way. So in the picture, you can see depicted kind of in your upper right-hand corner, there's a winemaker, and he's kind of over these holes in the ground. And those holes actually are these large pots that have been buried deep below. And they're huge. You can fit like 2 people inside of there sometimes. And it's a traditional way that they have aged all of their wines. They call them kivris. Sometimes the word amphora is maybe another one that might be a little bit more common, but in Georgia, they call it kivri. And what's interesting about this winemaking vessel is that the earth that it's buried in helps to moderate the temperature while the wine is fermenting. So in like normal winemaking, as wine's fermenting, it produces a bit of heat, and sometimes you have to have certain mechanisms to moderate the heat. And this just does it naturally with the earth itself. The interior of these vessels is lined with a little bit of beeswax, and that helps to kind of keep the vessel clean. But all of the grapes are harvested whole cluster. Everything from the stems, seeds, skins goes into the vessel, and then it's aged. And what's the result of this? It's an orange wine. A lot of the wines, like wine number 1, if you're drinking it already, is orangish in color. And I know last week we briefly talked about an orange wine because the wine that we had from Serbia was an orange wine in style. But you know, what exactly does that mean? What is an orange wine? Well, you guys are going to drink one. If you haven't already popped it open, this is a really cool example of orange wine. And basically, to make it, you take white grapes. They're growing on the vine. But the thing about white grapes, we call them white grapes, but they're not always white. Sometimes the grapes are green or orange or pink. And so if you age them and you macerate them, you mush them up, you foot trod, whatever, and then you just leave it in a vat, you don't take the skins out. The skins almost work how like a tea bag works with water. It slowly infuses and changes the color, but also imparts some really cool flavors. This process to making wine is very common throughout Georgia. You'll see it with almost all of their like white varietals, that they're kind of this orange wine or amber color. They call it orange wine because of the color. It's not actually made from oranges. Don't be mistaken. Sometimes people from Georgia will get really upset if you call it orange wine because they want to say that it's amber wine. So, you know, if you're over there and asking for orange wine and you get a little bit of like the stuck up nose, it might be because they want you to call it amber wine. But this is our wine number 1.
So tell us a little bit about this vineyard and what stands out about it, and besides it being orange, besides them making orange wine.
So this is from Dilo, and it is a 50-50 blend of 2 different grapes, Arcatatelli and Mezzvane. Arcatatelli is one of the main white grapes that is grown all over Georgia. It's easy to grow, it's resistant to the cold, and it somehow maintains a really nice level of acidity and sugar as it ripens. This wine itself would be, you know, like the Chardonnay of Georgia, if you will, because it also kind of has a creaminess on the palate. This grape itself can also be used for the production of brandy, which I know we mentioned earlier as sort of like when the USSR kind of made everyone do brandy instead of actually quality wines. This grape itself can be used for that too. So Dilo is a project of the same winemaker who makes our wine number 2 in our flight. And we'll go a little bit more into the history of those ones and the details. But for this one in particular, this is sort of a baby orange wine. The skin contact on this is not as long as other orange wines. It's only for about a month. Some other orange wines have skin contact for several months, making it even stronger in color and in flavor. So this is like a really, really good entry level baby step if this is your first orange wine. Tasting notes on this one. Chris, what do you think?
So tasting notes for me, this has some very bold, almost exotic flavors. Something that we talked about a little bit is what makes this wine orange in color. The skin is where you get a lot of the color for wine. So red grapes, white grapes, they both have the same color juice. The juice is clear. All of the texture and a lot of the flavor you get from wine comes from the skin itself. So the skin is what's giving us a little bit of this orange color, and it's also what's giving us this really kind of like exotic stone fruit. I'm getting like overripe peaches, maybe like nectarines. There's also this almost like jackfruit or something like that, cantaloupe, you know, something a little more exotic. To me, this also has like a really strong textural element. I don't know if you guys get that same sensation that I do, where you feel a little bit of grip on the palate, something that you might associate with a red wine. To me, this feels like a red wine on my palate, even though it's got the acidity and freshness of a white wine.
I think that this is a really interesting wine. And if you like this style and you want to like take it up a notch, I've got several at 13. I actually have a whole orange wine section of things that are by the bottle and a couple things that are by the glass. This is definitely the geeky wine of the night for sure.
I love this.
Really well with food. I think for me, sometimes white wines that can't hold up to like heavier dishes, you know, orange wine will be really great with pork, with some heavier poultry dishes, because it has that acidity, but it also has that texture.
And our food pairing recommendation of the evening was just maybe like a Moroccan spiced salmon with like some like couscous, a little bit of like lemon and some like fresh mint on here would go really well with this. But other orange wines, the ones that have even more skin contact have more tannin or that dryness to them. And it's kind of fun to pair it even with like a steak, because that tannin structure kind of helps with like the fattiness and the savoriness of the steak. It's definitely like a out of left field kind of pairing to impress your wine nerd friends.
100%. And I'm so glad you said that, because I think this wine, especially if you're new to orange wine, it is a food wine. It's something that's meant to complement different dishes. And by itself, if you've never had one of these before, and I know most of you have, because most of you have joined Adele and me on here at least at some point. But these wines they pair really well, and they, some of the, I don't want to say harsher qualities, but some of the more foreign kind of textures and flavors that you don't necessarily expect from either a red or a white wine go really well with food, and they kind of round it out, and you'll really get to see kind of those, the brightness in the different fruit that shows up in these wines. And so I think pairing with some of the Moroccan spices in particular is a really good way to dive into this bottle. So with that, we have another guest joining us this evening, and I would like to welcome my friend Jody from Exeter International, who's going to be sharing a little bit more about Georgia as a destination with us tonight. Her first experience traveling, like many of us who fell in love with travel and joined the travel industry, was with studying abroad. And after returning to the United States, it was a little bit jarring to get back to this way of life. And like me, she was fortunate enough to find a career and build a career in the travel industry. And one thing that I love about Exeter is that they really do focus in these Eastern European, Central Asian countries that really kind of bridge the East and the West together. And I'm super excited to welcome her tonight. So Jody, go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself to everybody.
So hello, I'm Jody. I'm actually very excited. The Caucasus is kind of my baby at our company, and it's my pet project. Region, and Georgia definitely for foodies and wine lovers is a standout, just because it is this fabulous destination for going and just eating and drinking your way through a holiday. It's kind of like the last great undiscovered food destination, I think, for Europe. And it's just this really great and kind of underrated hidden gem that people are just now starting to go to. And so Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, they're just fabulous countries. So I'm really excited that you invited me to talk about this. I'm quite jealous that I'm not drinking along with you guys this evening.
Well, next time.
Yeah, next time I go through Houston, I'm gonna have to stop in, because you guys are definitely carrying better Georgian wines than what we have here in San Antonio. So
we'll stock you up and make sure that you have your fix for as long as you need it. I'll put you in touch with Adele.
Absolutely.
Well, Jody, let's dive in and tell us, as we're departing from the United States, where are we touching down and where are we checking into today?
So I'll be honest, most people who are going to go to Georgia are going to do it in a combination. And so you're going to be coming to Georgia either through Armenia or Azerbaijan. But there are people who are now doing standalone Georgia programs for like food and wine. And if you're doing that, you're going to come right into Tbilisi, and you're going to head straight to your hotel. And you have my 3 kind of top hotels up here, and they all offer something different. The Tbilisi Marriott recently got completely overhauled and is this gorgeous, very traditional hotel that if you like to stay a little in your comfort zone but still want a great location and service, this is just honestly the top-notch choice. But then you have these other 2 hotels. So Stamba and Rooms Hotel are actually owned by the same person, same company, and Stamba's just kind of the more upscale design version of Rooms. So if you are a person who loves a design hotel, you can see from the picture, like there are trees growing in the lobby, and like there's an atrium, and the owner has this fabulous cafe where he imported a bunch of like chandeliers and booths from a New York City cafe that he loved and was going out of business. And it's really popular with the locals. So it has this really great international feel that brings in locals. So these are kind of like the fabulous hotels that I definitely recommend. And they're all well located for you to be able to get to the sites and to the restaurants. So
That's super important.
Yes.
Access to the restaurants is one of the key things I look for when it comes to a hotel. So that's super important to know. And I think many of our viewers here feel the exact same way. So tell us a little bit more about how many days you would spend in Tbilisi and what some of the highlights of the city are that make it stand out both as a foodie destination and a cultural one.
Yeah, so some people will go and they'll kind of, I don't want to switch hotels a bunch, so you can absolutely stay in Tbilisi and do day trips to some of the other regions, in which case, I definitely would recommend staying at least 4 nights so that you can really get all of that in. If you're just gonna do Tbilisi on its own and then kind of branch out to the other fabulous areas, I think, 2 days is perfectly adequate to kind of see the sights. That will get you through the old town to see like the fortress and to kind of take the funicular up, get these beautiful overviews and enjoy some of kind of the fabulous restaurants. The great thing about Georgia for food is that it doesn't really matter where you go, the food is going to be amazing. It does, like, you have these really fabulous kind of fusion or nouveau restaurants that are taking a new take, like doing a new take on Georgian cuisine in Tbilisi. But even when you get, and it's the same for Armenia, even when you get outside of Tbilisi and outside of Yerevan, you're going to find these really lovely family-owned kind of so the food's fabulous. So yeah, 2 days. There's some really great museums here. Really lovely historical museum here that has some of those artifacts you're talking about, where if you want to go and learn about the history of wine development, they've got the museum there for that. The Modern Art Museum here is also really fabulous. Tbilisi's really had a resurgence of new, like, youth coming in and really building up these new modern things. So it's really this lovely city of, you have like modern architecture leading right into something that's 500 years old. So
I think that is so cool. And correct me if I'm wrong, but because you might know better than I do at this point, but I believe both Georgia and Armenia are a couple of the only countries that are open to US travelers right now. Is that like with the little asterisk?
Yeah, so a bit of an asterisk. So Armenia, technically the borders are open, but there's a caveat as far as getting into the country and the testing that you have to do, because they're just setting up the testing sites at the moment. Georgia very much follows the EU in all things. So, Georgia is open to EU countries, but currently is not open to Americans. And Georgia very much wants to be a part of NATO and the EU, and so they very much align kind of international policies like that along EU lines. So,
well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that Tbilisi is a really great place to stay if you want to base yourself and explore some of the other surrounding areas. Can you tell us about where some of those places are that you would recommend traveling to that are outside of the city?
Yeah, so on the side you have Borjoni, which I think is, myself and my colleague who do Georgia think it's a bit of an underrated area. You kind of have this Crown Plaza Hotel there that, I know that doesn't sound wonderful, but it weirdly is. It's like 3 floors, and the first floor is just a spa. I think there's only like 60 rooms or something. It's not a very big hotel, but it's a giant spa. And it's in this kind of lovely gorge area, so you have this natural beauty. And really the reason you come out here is to go see some of the sites that are in this area. So you have like Rabati Castle, and you have Vardzia, which is this monastic cave that is just mind-blowing and unique, because there was an earthquake, so part of it sheared off. So you actually kind of like see into the honeycomb of this like monastic cave.
Wow.
So yeah, it's just this really interesting area with lots of history. And of course you are getting into a different wine region as well when you're coming out this way.
And this is, let's dive in a little bit more into some of the history here. When I was reading about it and kind of familiarizing myself with the destination a little bit more, it sounds like there's a museum that is specific to, is this the place where there's a museum specific to Joseph Stalin, or is that somewhere else?
It's not in Borjoni, but you absolutely could do it on your way to Borjoni. It's in Gori, which is where Stalin's actually from, and it's this very kind of strange museum, and it's love it or hate it for Americans. So you go and you're like, this is very interesting, or you go and you're like, this is very propagandish. And it's very, because it was built during the time when Stalin was still greatly revered. So it definitely is like, here's all the wonderful things. We're just gonna slide over the rest of it. So it's a very unique museum.
Yeah, that it sounds really interesting. And I actually got a little bit ahead of myself because we did have a little bit more info to share about it on this this next slide in our show. So tell us a little bit more. You and I talked about the Caucasus and how we have some more active travelers on here. I know we have some people who have been to the Caucasus at one point. Tell us a little bit more about what you would do visiting this area from the Georgian side and what really stands out in addition to Gori. And let's dive a little deeper into that.
So yeah, if you are an active person, you definitely want to go to Mount Kazbegi, which is in Stepnitsa. And that's just like, if you've ever seen a picture, like a brochure of Georgia, you've probably seen a picture of Mount Kazbegi. Like it's just this gorgeous mountain, uninterrupted. So there I recommend the rooms Kazbegi. It's kind of a ski hotel in the winter. So definitely if you are into hiking, you can either do light hiking directly from the hotel, or you can do some more intensive hikings or, active pursuits very nearby. It's just this really fabulous area. And the hotel has a giant panoramic front facing looking at the mountainside. So it's just this really scenic thing. And other things you can do here is on the way, you can go through Michketa, which is kind of the spiritual heart of Georgia. This is where some of the older monasteries are, and it's really this kind of very ingrained and traditional area. So you can go into these still very active churches and monasteries and kind of see the Georgian church, which is still very much a part of Georgian life, in action. And then there's also, if you didn't go out to Borjomi and so you didn't see Vardzia, Uplichki, which is another monastic cave, is over in this area. So you can, if you didn't want to travel all that way over to Borjomi, you could definitely still get a little bit of that experience at Uplichki.
That's super good to know, especially if people are a little bit short on time or combining destinations and country hopping. It's good to know that this is kind of where you can have one of those similar experiences. So let's move into wine country. I know that you've had the opportunity to visit yourself, and I'm so jealous of that. I think Adele and I both love Georgian wine, and we're just super excited to get into all of this. But tell us a little bit about what happens when we get to Kakheti and where we're staying before we really get into the destination and start eating and drinking, because that's why we're here.
So in the Kakheti region, the Radisson, again, not like a hotel you think of, a chain you think of as being luxury, but they opened one of their few collection hotels on the Sinandalia estate. So it's this historic wine estate that was owned by a member of the royal Georgian family. And so it's got this great history, and the hotel is literally sitting next to the vineyards with vineyard views on one side and mountains on the other side. So just this really gorgeous area. And the hotel, because of where it's situated, it has an in-house sommelier and tasting room and wine cellar. So it's definitely the place to stay in the area if you are there for the wine tasting. And if you are into wine, you need 2 days here because there are literally so many fabulous family-owned local, in the last one you guys talked about, you're not going to find the next great vineyard in Italy. They're all discovered. Georgia's the place where you're going to find that little place that no one's ever heard of, and they might only export to maybe Russia, and that's kind of it. And so unless you visit it as American, you're never going to taste those wines. So that's, to me, really fabulous about this area. So the Sinandalia estate, the Radisson that's there, that to me is just, that's the
place to stay.
Yeah, and you're still really close to, there's 2 towns in the area that are really popular to visit, which are Signagi and Talavi. And so like Signagi, you can stay in that town. There are like hotels. They're not quite at the level that the Radisson's going to be at, but they're still like perfectly fine. But it's like this it feels like you picked up something right out of a European fairy tale and dropped it into Georgia. Cobblestone streets with like balconies overlooking it and just like these winding alleyways. And it has really fabulous restaurants for being this kind of tiny town, like Pheasant's Tears, which gets written up a lot. It's located in Signagi, so it is a really, really great town. And this is, sorry, I'm gonna let you talk because I will.
No, go ahead. No, I had a question. Go ahead. I've got a question for you, but
I was just gonna say, and kind of one of the things that I think is really fabulous, if you have the opportunity to be here in the autumn when, you know, wine picking is going on and they are putting the wines directly into the Quervi, like you can have this opportunity to see that winemaking in action, which is so unique and so different than, you know, if you go to like a European style winery. This is such a different way of making wine. It's pretty unique to a lot of Americans. So I think that that's really, like, this is an area where you're going to find lots of wineries that are using the Quervi and doing it traditionally.
That's really, that's super cool because I think that's what part of the experience is for all of us here. I did have a question from Adele. She was asking what kind of outlets and plug converters do you need here? I think it's the same as Europe. Yeah. And so I do want to ask you about one of the experiences you shared with me. Tell me about, is it Iago's?
Yeah,
and what stands out about that?
So Iago's unfortunately is not in Kakheti, but it's not very far to Tbilisi either. But he's this wonderful gentleman who, after Georgia gained its freedom from the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union had kind of, same as with Armenia, had kind of said, we're only going to do these specific wines and we're going to make wine in more like European styles because it's faster and it makes more. And they were masters of efficiency in that sense, but they lost a lot of like what really made the Georgian wine special. And so Iago was really instrumental in bringing this back to Georgia and really bringing back this traditional way of making wine. And he actually created an annual festival for it. And so he still hosts, they don't live in it anymore, but it's their traditional family home that's on the vineyard. They've outgrown it now. But they host, you can go over there for dinner and have dinner there, and they pair their dinner that his wife and mother and sister are cooking with the wines that they make on the estate. And you can also do this really fabulous experience where you can have Degori singers, which is this traditional way of singing in Georgia. It's polyphonic singing, and literally every time I go to Georgia, I'm like, please let this be on my itinerary. I will never get tired of it. I love it to pieces.
That's really good to know. Just when it comes to what is really special, that stands out, that's something you can do again and again and again. And it's always going to be special. It's always going to feel meaningful to be a part of that. Well, Jody, thank you for joining us. It has been such a pleasure to have you here tonight. Before we get into our second wine of the evening, though, if anybody does have any questions and wants to unmute themselves and ask Jody specifically, I invite you to do so now. It's your chance to ask her anything and everything about Georgia that you've ever wanted to know.
What's the prevalence of English speaking, or do you need a guide if you're going to go around to places like this?
So you're definitely going to want a guide. When you're in the capital cities and in all three of the Caucasus countries, you're going to find English is a little bit more prevalent just because that's where a lot of the youth are moving to. That's where universities are going to be that are going to be teaching in English. But once you get out into the more rural countryside, it's not going to be as prevalent. So when we do trips to Georgia, we do have a guide with you all the time, the same guide throughout the country, so that, you kind of build rapport, and also you always have that person there to help you with any kind of language barriers.
And that's what we're here for, right, Jody?
Yeah, I'm going to stay on because I I mean, I'm not talking anymore, but I'm always happy to hear what anyone says about this region because I do love it that much. So if you do come up with another question on Georgia, I will still be here. So
Awesome. Well, so if anybody does, like Jody said, come up with another question or you want to hop in later, you're more than welcome to. But with that, Adele, let's get into our second wine of the evening. I know we're moving on to reds now, and let's dive in. Let's open this bad boy and talk about go into a little bit more detail on Georgian wine and how the red wine stands out compared to the whites and the oranges.
So if you guys haven't already opened up your bottle, you'll notice that this has a wax sort of cap on it. And sometimes you guys might encounter these as you're going through it. Depending on the wax, sometimes you can just kind of like gently cut around it. Other times, if it's super thick wax, you can literally just take the worm of your corkscrew and just like get right in there, and it'll kind of pop off as you're getting in there. But sometimes the wax can prevent you from easily accessing and quickly accessing your wine when you need it the most. But hopefully, if you guys were able to successfully open up your wine, we are on the Orgo Semperave. This is the same winemaker that did the Deleo, which is from the same region. I looked it up on the map. It's about an hour and 45 minutes from the main city if you were to like touch down in Georgia. Not too far out of the way, but further east into the hills. This is where I think your guide is definitely going to be needed. And this grape is 100% Semperave, which, as we mentioned before, is the main grape that's red in all of Georgia. And this is made by a winemaker he's very young now, but he's like the very end line of this like multi-generation winemaking Georgians that have kind of an interesting history that starts more than 100 years ago with the winemaker's great grandfather. And he was a priest in the church. And he was actually one of the first in the family that started the whole winemaking thing because of Christian motives. And as we know, in the Orthodox Church, you use wine as, the blood of Christ. Kristen, I know that at your wedding, that we did the thing. I'm not confirmed Catholic, but you did the thing.
Yes, I had a Catholic wedding.
We were there. There was no air conditioning. It was hot. We sweated in church.
It was in Vermont. It wasn't that bad.
It was fine. It was good. It was a beautiful wedding. We're happy to be there. But so back to this. So several generations ago, one of the first people to start making wine because of Christ and needing wine for the sacraments. Flash forward a couple more generations. Now we're at the great-grandfather of the current winemaker, and he was actually killed by the Soviets because of his Christian beliefs. So just kind of going into like more of like this history of how like the Soviets really screwed things up for this country and all of those around them. So after that, a few generations later, we have now the winemaker's grandfather, and he studied enology school, met his wife, who is also in enology school, and then the current winemaker's father was actually one of the pioneers of reviving the wine technology in Georgia, specializing in the quivery or the kivri or the vessels that are buried in the ground. They're kind of like one of the first people to like bring this back and make it great. So this producer is very, very important for Georgian wine. Another one that's not here in the United States, but is one of, I think, the most famous, great producers is called Pheasant's Tears. If you see them, I think you can get them in New York, maybe, but they're not quite here in Texas, but they are like one of my, like the holy grail of Georgian wine. And I love that Jody had mentioned about how you can actually go someplace and have that experience. Last week we talked about like going wine hunting in Serbia. Like you can go wine hunting in Georgia. You can be the one that discovers and finds like that next hot wine region or winemaker or style or whatever and bring it back that no one's ever heard of before. Like you can't do that in Tuscany or in Piedmont, or even in Rioja for that matter, because it's already been done. But these are the countries that you go and you can really have those really cool experiences and be the first to do it. And for some maybe potential inspired wine importers, this is definitely the place to look. And I hate to share the secrets because maybe that might be me and Chris's plan one day. I don't know.
Adele, I have an idea. Why don't we take everybody who is here with us tonight wine hunting in Georgia next year?
Would love to.
I think it's great. Let's do it.
We can dream. Hopefully, that'll be something that we can talk about a little bit more in the future. But Adele, let's get into food. What would you pair with this? I have this photo that Jody shared with me of kind of a traditional meal, and I sent you guys a recipe for another one of what I thought would be a good pair with this. Just like a very typical Georgian dish with they're called kinkali, I think, and they're like these meat dumplings. And I sent you guys a recipe from Food and Wine. This is not that, but I thought that the different flavors here and the cheese and the veggies and the sauces and everything was kind of like a perfect idea or a perfect pairing to go with this. What do you two think?
I definitely think that this is an interesting red wine. It's aged in the Quivri just like all the other ones. And if you notice in your glass, if you have it, swirl it around a little bit. This is a highly extracted red wine. It stains your glass. Like I feel like I'm trying to brush my teeth after like having a glass of it because it's so extracted. And that's again due to this traditional winemaking technique of taking a whole cluster of the grapes and throwing it into the amphora or the kibri and macerating it for about a month. The other cool thing about this wine and some of the others that you'll find, a lot of the vineyards are 50 to 80 years old, which isn't the oldest. You know, last week when we went to Serbia, we had that 400-year-old vine that can be found. And the reason why the Georgian wine vines aren't quite as old is because all of the Russians made them rip them out. But still, 50 to 80-year-old vines produces more concentrated fruit in a lower quantity. Like each vine will produce a fewer clusters, but the quality of the fruit is so much better. And this red wine, if you were to like compare it to something else, I would definitely say it's kind of like a Syrah with that pepperiness meets maybe like a Blaufränkisch from like when we talked about Austria and we had that Morch Blaufränkisch on there. I think that this is a food-friendly, versatile wine that could go from vegetable dishes with that extracted fruit to then pairing with even like bigger things like roasted meats because of that peppery kind of quality to the finish.
Love it. That sounds like a fantastic compliment to this wine. So let's keep things going and from Georgia continue our travels through the Caucasus region and touch down in Armenia. And Jody, you might recognize some of this information from Exeter. But according to ancient Armenian wisdom, you are as many a person as languages as you know, and no greater truth can be spoken of this tiny landlocked nation. The capital city of Yerevan is a study in cultural revolution. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. It's alive with artistic tradition. There are art galleries, concert halls, parks, cafes, and they buzz with activity in one of the oldest inhabited cities of the world, which is just fascinating to me. Belief in the ancient Indo-Aryan pantheon evolved into Zoroastrianism, and Christianity came much later. And even today, the Armenian church exists as a result of the native diaspora in many parts of the world. The name Armenia is even a derivation of Hayastan, which is derived from Hayek, which is supposedly one of the descendants of Noah from biblical times. And this is a great jumping off spot to explore the Armenian countryside, Lake Savan, the hot springs of Arzny and Zhermukh, the forest of Dilejan, and many of the mountain caves and cliffs in the southeast region, which I will let Chris tell you guys a little bit more about. autumn is the best time to visit, whether you're there to drink wine or just to explore the scenery. And when you're staying in Yerevan, Jody had kind of mentioned earlier how these countries are typically combined, and it's really easy to stay in one of the major cities and base yourself as you explore other parts of the country. And Yerevan has a hotel called the Alexander, which is part of Marriott's luxury collection, and it is in the perfect location to either catch a concert at the Opera Theater. It's like a 5-minute walk. Take an evening walk along Northern Avenue, which is this luxurious residential area that has a bunch of cafes you can stop in and kind of explore. And then you can relax at the famous Republic Square while enjoying the singing fountains. And so with that, Chris has already jumped in and shared some of his insight into the region and the region's wines with us, but he studied at Tufts University. He has worked for the Hillstone Restaurant Group in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Dallas, and now Houston. And while managing Houston's restaurants, he fell in love with wine. He ran the company for 2 locations here in Houston, or excuse me, the beverage program. And then he was formerly at Camerata, and that's where I remember meeting Chris and drinking with him. And now Chris kind of had a different take on approaching the whole quarantine and lockdown to me and Adele, but he started a podcast, and it's called By the Glass, which is super easy to remember. So tune in. He talks to sommeliers, winemakers, chefs, and importers. And when he's not drinking, he is running marathons. I had no idea about that. We'll have to talk about that a little bit more at some point, Chris. But with that, tell us a little bit about Yerevan and what to do and the different day trips that you would take.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited to speak to all of you today. I know we've got some amazing travelers here. I'm a big traveler myself. I've always loved kind of exploring different places. And, you know, I really fell in love when I studied abroad in Madrid. It was during my year abroad in college that I really fell in love with wine. Wine was cheaper than the water or the soda, so I had really nothing else to drink. And in the years since, I've always made a point to travel, and it's a great way to just experience culture. So that's something that's really important to me. I haven't made it to Armenia myself, but I have a lot of extended family that has been to Armenia. Both my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family, they're both from Armenia. I had grandparents that came over in the 1920s and 30s. And I've had cousins as well as aunts and uncles that have been to the motherland. And, you know, what they've told me is that it's a country full of potential. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but Armenia's been through some serious turmoil over the years. As we've talked about, you know, Armenia was the first country to adopt Christianity on a national level in 301 AD. And because of that, there was always, you know, conquests of other countries that were trying to, you know, put their religion on Armenia. And, you know, the biggest kind of like the two most catastrophic events to Armenia were, you know, the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey's genocide of Armenia in 1915. It kind of coincided with World War I, and then the absorption into the USSR. Because of that, the country only has about 25, 30 years of, you know, autonomy. And it's through that time that they've started to develop a little bit of a niche for themselves. The image that you see in front of you is of Lake Savan, which is kind of the summertime destination for most Armenians. It's one of the largest lakes in Armenia. It is almost 500 square miles in size. And because of that, there's plenty of space for jet skiing. There's lots of, you know, bed and breakfasts that are located there as well. It's a really popular spot for people in the country to go. If you go just north of that, there's a really amazing area of Dilijan, which is great for hiking. That's the forest that was talked about earlier. Here's an image of that, just really, really beautiful. Armenia is a country just full of beautiful nature. Driving outside of Yerevan means just undulating hills. You have the foothills of Mount Ararat within Armenia. And within Christianity, which you see in this photo here, it's a snow-capped mountain And to the left of it, you see Little Ararat is what they call it. But Mount Ararat on the right, that larger snow-capped mountain, that is allegedly the place where Noah's Ark landed, which is really, really exciting. Allegedly,
Wow.
after the floods, that is where the Ark landed. And that snow-capped mountain is kind of the symbol of Armenia. If you look at old images of the country's emblem, the country's flag previously, that was on there. It was as symbolic to the country as Mount Fuji is to Nippon or Japan. And, you know, it does kind of look like Mount Fuji. It has a similar sort of like arc to it. But
minus the vineyards.
Minus the vineyards, of course, yeah. But it's through kind of like the snow on top of the mountain that melts, that provides a little bit of irrigation to some of the vineyards below. Mount Ararat at this point is now on Turkish land. And when it comes to visiting the country, you know, the challenge in getting to Armenia is that, you know, it's a landlocked country. All of the borders are pretty militarized with the exception of the border with Georgia. My relatives that have been, they were able to drive from Armenia into Georgia, but they had to fly from another country into Yerevan proper. You can't drive from Armenia into Turkey. You certainly can't get into Azerbaijan. Those countries do not get along very well, Azerbaijan and Armenia. So, but between Georgia and Armenia, there's a really great relationship there, and there's easy kind of access from one country to the other. So
that's really good to know, just because I know, I mean, all of us as Americans, when we travel, we combine destinations. We never go just to like one place, especially when we're traveling that far. And so it's always really nice to get some insight into what makes the most sense. One of the common questions that I encounter when kind of pairing destinations is, you think like, oh, in Northern Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia, they're right next to each other. It should be really easy just to like pop over. And sometimes the answer is, well, no, those countries don't make sense to combine because you're actually routing through three just to get there because of the geopolitics of the area.
Yeah. My cousin that spent time in both Turkey and in Armenia, the flight from Istanbul to Yerevan, they have one flight a week and it's at 2 a.m. So she said they make it very hard to go from Turkey to Armenia. It's not something that they, you know, very much encourage. So
for sure. Well, glad that you mentioned that, because if anybody is visiting and routing through Turkey, because in most normal times we do have direct flights to Istanbul daily. The Turkish Airlines Turkish Airlines actually has a program where if you have a very long layover, they will arrange a guide and a driver for you and take you out and about in the city to see all of the sites before heading back into the airport in time for your flight. Because I think so if you ever are combining, there are ways to like make it make sense and kind of get an extra little visit in there. But with that, tell us a little, let's open this wine. This bottle looks really cool. The packaging's fantastic. I have it open as well. And let's dive in and share a little bit more details with us about how it's made, how it's aged, and what stands out about it.
I think, yeah. So I think the packaging is something that's hard to ignore on this wine. And that's sometimes, I think Adele and I can probably speak to this together, but you know, there are wines that we love that drink really well, but sometimes don't have great packaging. And I think Eastern Europe is one of those places where sometimes the packaging leaves a little bit to be desired. You know, you never want to judge a book by its cover, but I think that
one of my least favorite things is when a label has a sticker on it that says 99 points from blah, blah, who cares? That is like, I've literally asked my reps, I'm like, do you guys have any of these bottles that don't have the stickers on them? Because like, I don't, that to me is retail when it has the stickers. But if I'm going to have something in like the bar or restaurant environment, like having a clean, proper label, like the Zora, is very nice.
So, you know, that's a really important thing. So I want to show the label here. I mean, you all have it too. This is a really beautifully designed label, which speaks to the founder's background in fashion. So Zorik Garibian, Zorik was a gentleman that grew up for most of his life in Milan. Milan, as some of you might know, is kind of the fashion capital of Italy. He had a very successful career working in fashion. And then at a certain point, after, making his money, decided he wanted to open a winery. There's an old expression that if you want to make a small fortune in the wine industry, start with a large fortune. So Zorik decided he wanted to make wine, and he was going to open a winery maybe in Tuscany. That was his goal. But before he did that, he went to go visit his motherland. He was born in Armenia and then emigrated to Italy, but he returned home and saw these really beautiful vineyards, really ancient sites. Armenian vineyards in the region of Bayat Zor, those are some of the highest elevation vineyards in the entire world. We're over about a mile in elevation, which, Adele can attest from the wines that she served. Very rare that you find wines at 1,1600 meters elevation.
Yeah.
And when you have vineyards that are planted at such a high elevation, they have this really amazing shift in temperature. From the day to the night, there might be a temperature swing of as much as 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the case of Bayat Zor, this region, it's so high elevation, it's such a mountainous area that these grapes are really just treated in a very rustic sort of way. Days can be very warm, evenings can be very, very cold. And as a result, you end up with a grape that grows on the vine in a very hardy sort of way, which makes for a very concentrated wine. Zorik establishes the winery around the turn of the century, early aughts. He's trying to figure out where he can source the right grapes, because really, he is one of the only people making wine in Armenia right now. There are certainly wineries that exist. We've talked a little bit about the USSR's designation of brandy production. USSR said, Hungary, you can make wine. They said, Georgia, you can make a little bit of wine. But Armenia, despite its rich, rich history in wine production, they were designated a brandy country. So all of these amazing vineyards had to be ripped out in favor of that higher producing, higher yielding, vineyard. Really, really unfortunate. Zorik has done an amazing job over the past 10 years or so, really revitalizing some of those old vineyards, working with 100-year-old vineyards that are planted very close to monasteries, and making just really delicious wine. We talked a little bit earlier about these kevri. So in the image you see in front of you, those are kevri. You can always tell the difference between a kevri and an amphora because a kevri has a pointed bottom. It kind of has a pointed bottom, so they can't stand on their own. They kind of have to be tipped on their side like that. And that's why they're buried underground. Aside from the temperature regulation, they can't stand on their own. Amphora were used for transportation, and those can stand because they have a flat bottom. So
that's super interesting. I did not know that.
So kevri is the Georgian word for that container that they have, and that pointed bottom allows all of the sediment. Adele was talking about how the grapes are put in whole cluster, so the stems and the skins, they kind of like just move down all the way to the bottom, all the way to that tipped point. Here in Armenia, if you flip this bottle around, you can see that it's called karasi, Karasi. The Armenian word for an amphora is karas, Karas. So this wine means from amphora or from karas. So these wines are aged in amphora. And what's so cool is that Zorik, rather than making amphora, like modern amphora, he's literally going village to village. He's the amphora whisperer of Armenia, and he's trying to find ancient amphora. And you have these people that maybe it's an heirloom family object. It's this, bit of history that's been passed down generation to generation. And he's talked about going to these families and saying, you have this amphora in your backyard. Can I have it? And they're like, please take it. We're tired of it. It's just sitting back there. It's an eyesore. And he'll take it. He'll rehabilitate it because oftentimes there are chips or cracks. He'll fill them in. I read an interview with him where he said that he literally had to break down a wall in someone's home to get the amphora out because it was such a big amphora. Really, really interesting. So, I think Zorik, he's going to be known for many things. He's one of the preeminent, winemakers in Armenia right But what he really wants to be known for is revitalizing, the amphora production the way that the Dachishvili family has in Georgia.
That's super interesting. And it is, I feel like I learned so many new things that I didn't know, which is always like a really cool experience to have when we have our experts on here. I am getting a few questions coming in, and if you guys are sending them to only me, I can't view them because of how I have everything set up today. So unmute yourselves, ask Chris, ask Adele, or send them to Adele in person. And while you're getting comfortable with the idea of doing that, tell us a little bit, Chris, tell us a little bit about what you would pair, what type of food you would pair with this.
Absolutely. So, there's an expression that we use oftentimes in the wine world, which is if it grows together, it goes together. And if you think about Armenian food, it's very much defined by that kind of like mountainous cuisine. So you don't have cattle in Armenia. It's too hilly, it's too mountainous. Lamb is a more common, item that's served. There's no large body of water aside from Lake Savan, so there's not a lot of seafood. Really, the main cuisine here, you've got lamb, eggplant, olive oil. These are kind of like the main things. I would say that the holy triumvirate of Armenian cooking is lavash, which is a really thin flatbread, lamb, and maybe eggplant. That's what I grew up on. That was my meat and potatoes. So.
I love it.
Well, and I want to jump in real quick again. So when I was kind of researching Armenia and the history of the country and the history of wine, it is a super small country, and only 3 million people claim it as home right now. But with that being said, over 8 million people worldwide claim to be Armenian these days. So I think it is, Chris, you mentioned that you're Armenian, and I think it's something really interesting to note that although people have emigrated from Armenia, there's this strong like cultural history and like sense of identity and heritage that goes with being Armenian. And while people are widely dispersed, they've almost become ambassadors of the country, of the wine, of the food, and they're making it accessible to on an international scale. So I think that's really awesome.
Growing up, at this point, it was like 25 years ago, I remember telling people I was Armenian, and people would be like, "Where's Armenia?" And I would jokingly say, "Oh, it's right next to Azerbaijan," because it was like these far-flung places that people knew nothing about. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, I love the lady, but my grandmother was such a fan of Kim Kardashian, because my grandmother, imagine a 95-year-old woman, my grandmother was just happy that someone was speaking about Armenia, giving it some sort of light. Because you got to remember, about 15 years ago, the most famous Armenian was Dr. Kevorkian, Dr. Death. We didn't have a lot going for us back then. Cher is an Armenian. Kind of one of the telltale signs that someone's Armenian is if they have a really hard to pronounce last name that ends in I-A-N. The winemaker here, Zorit Garibian, my name, Chris Poldoian.
Yeah, your name too.
Yeah, Kim Kardashian, and then
I-A-N.
Dr. Kevorkian, and then Cher, when she had a last name, it was Sarkissian, but obviously kind of hard to pronounce, so she ditched it, won a couple of Grammys, and just became Cher.
She just has one name now. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Thank you for joining us, Jody. I do want to open up the floor for questions if any of you guys have some tonight. But before we do that, I do want to let you guys know that next week we will be heading to Israel and Lebanon, and we have special guests from both the travel and the wine industry joining us again. We're now on Instagram. We are on YouTube. We kind of redid our YouTube plan. So if you happen to miss the live episode on a Wednesday, we will post the recording of that on Fridays, and then we'll start sharing older episodes on Mondays. So we now have 2 episodes live. We have New York's Finger Lakes region live, and we have last week's visit to Slovenia, Hungary, and Serbia live. And we are thankful that you guys join us, and we are excited to visit these places next week. And with that, let's open up the floor. And if you have any questions for me, Adele, Chris, or Jody, now is your chance.
Hey, Kristen, do you think if I become super famous, I can drop my last name and just go as Adele?
I think there might be some confusion.
Dang it.
Maybe, yeah?
I think you can do it. I think
The other Adele.
And then Chris, I think, is going to hang out with us next week too, to mention some things about Lebanon. Are you coming next week too?
I am. So
Yeah.
the podcast that I run,
Awesome.
I actually will be releasing my episode with Chateau Moussard's winery. I interviewed them to talk about not only the wines that they make, but kind of the aftermath of the Beirut explosion. So that episode will come out on Wednesday of this coming week, just in time for our conversation. So
It's super cool.
That's awesome. I actually spoke with our travel guest who's joining us next week. Her name's Maria Merrill, and she is with a company called Artisans of Leisure. Travel and Leisure magazine just named her company the #1 tour operator in the world. And she's from Houston. She and I actually grew up together. We went to high school together and middle school and all of that. But she was speaking about what's happening in Lebanon and how that's affecting everything right now. So she'll dive into that as well. So it'll be super exciting to have both of you guys sharing more about all of that.
I love it.
Yeah.
I'm really excited for that because like that was big news that just happened.
Yeah, it really was. And I think, I mean, Israel and Jordan and Egypt, what we kind of define as the Holy Land, have a lot going on right now. And some of these countries are actually open to Americans at the moment. So it'll be fun to have both of you guys sharing a little bit more insight into what's going on there. But enough about all of that. If anybody wants to unmute themselves, if someone sent a question that didn't get answered, hop on, and we have both Jody and Chris here to answer for you guys.
I have a question for both Georgia and Armenia, if anybody knows. It seems like if every household had their own amphora, and I don't remember the other word, kvi? Kevri. If every household had their own like kevri and was clearly then making wine in their backyard or their cellar, is it a weird thing now that there's maybe larger vineyards, or has the production scaled up and that's kind of a totally new, even besides the influence and quelling of the industry from the USSR?
No. It's a good question. So, those kevri that Zurich has been sourcing, not everyone has those. It was kind of like a family heirloom item. Some people might have had one because it had been passed down for many, many years. I mean, these countries, you got to remember, they're very proud of their anthropological past. And we talked about it a little bit, but the oldest winery to exist is in Armenia. It was found in a cave maybe about 10 years ago. It's kind of confusing, but the grape that you're drinking, this is made with a grape called Areni. There is a town called Areni, and then this particular cave that was discovered is the Areni 1 cave. And it's the oldest example of wine production in the entire world. Nothing predates this particular cave. If you visit Armenia and if you visit other areas close to Armenia, those sort of anthropological sites are big kind of like destinations. And I think that families that had a kevri or had an amphora, it was seen as an object that you were very proud of, but it by no means means that every family made their own wine. Actually, within Armenia, because of all of the Soviet influence, vodka and brandy, drinking hard spirits, that became kind of the culture over the past 50, 60 years. It's only in the past 10, 15 years that people are really drinking a lot of wine. And even Zora, the wine that we're drinking, within Armenia, it's not necessarily a very commonly consumed beverage. Most of Zora's production is exported to other countries. I actually had some relatives that drove all the way to Zora's winery only to be turned away at the door. Here are some Americans that were so excited, some Armenian, people that wanted to see the winery, and they got to the winery and they said, no, we don't give tours. So they're not quite as developed as Georgia is. We've seen that a lot of Georgian wineries have the ability to give tours. They've got amazing, places to stay in wine country. That's not really a thing yet in Armenia. It's still an agricultural product that hasn't gotten to the point where tourism can be monetized.
I will say that Armenia is getting a lot better. When I was there last year in October, they're doing massive infrastructure because they've seen what Georgia's doing, and they're like, we want in on that. We want that tourism. And so they're building the hotels and they're developing the infrastructure. So it's definitely, if you're going there, you're getting there early. You're getting there while that boon is still being developed, and it is a fabulous destination.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I did want to say one thing, and I think that you guys, Kristen and Adele, might agree with me a little bit. But if you go and visit a winery in Armenia or Georgia and you love the wine, please buy it while you're there, because the likelihood that you're going to find that wine back here in the US is very, very limited. And Iago's, which is my favorite, there's one importer in America, and he's in California, and he can't export outside of California. And so every year I regret that I have a carry-on only.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because someone who's on this, I can't remember what her name was, came in last night and she was saying Zora is the only Armenian wine you can find. And I was asking Chris earlier, it's basically the only quality wine that really is available on the market in Texas right now. And we were saying Phoenicia is a cool spot downtown that it's like a grocer. You can always get prepared foods, and they have a really interesting selection of Eastern European, Middle East, Caucasus area wines, but the quality is very questionable.
So many of those red grapes were used to make sweet wine.
Yeah.
So if sweet red wine is your vibe, then certainly go to Phoenicia. You can find some Armenian wine there. But if you're more in the style of dry red wine, kind of one similar to what we're drinking tonight, then I would not recommend the Armenian wine that you see at Phoenicia.
Yeah, but would be a cool place to source a food pairing for these wines if you only open up one of them tonight and you want to save the other two for later. Phoenicia would be a great idea to go pick up some stuff from.
And if you have, here in San Antonio, we have it's called a European grocer, but it's really just a post-Soviet, so Polish, Russian, Armenian, Georgian. But I actually found Sulguni cheese there, which is the cheese that's very prevalent in Georgia that you make khachapuri cheese bread with. Which you can also just eat kind of on a charcuterie board. So if you have something like that there in Houston, that's a great option for just picking up snacks that you could pair with it if you didn't want to do a whole meal.
I love it. That's awesome.
May I chime in? May I ask? Yeah. Hi. So I'm fairly familiar with Armenian wines. I know many of the winemakers in Armenia, including Zorik. So one thing is that Phoenicia now has Armas, so they've added to their collection. So distributors in Texas are kind of expanding their repertory of Armenian wines. And so there's Armas, and I would recommend that. And actually I have a question about that. So in Armenia, there are a host of incredible women who are involved in winemaking, including the CEO of Armas. And there are other winemakers and people involved, women involved in the winemaking industry at various levels. So my question is, and I don't know too much about Georgia, I know about Georgian winemaking, but I don't know about women in Georgia, the way Armenians Armenian women are participating in this Renaissance winemaking in Armenia, which isn't just Zora. There are multiple incredible winemakers, including some of them women. So do you guys know about women in Georgia and their involvement in the wine industry?
Fantastic question. And I'm about to get on the internet and like do some searches as soon as like we get out of here, because like I'm a huge fan of women winemakers, and every year at 13 for the month of October, like I do a whole feature on women winemakers, and we make a donation from the sales to a local breast cancer place in here. And I don't know. Do you know it? I mean, have you come across any like badass women winemakers from Georgia or Armenia?
I haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I want to look this up like right now. Like, that's a great question. And also probably going to lead me into like a multi-hour research project. And I'm very excited about.
I think that's a really fantastic point, especially considering that October is next week.
Yeah.
And 13 Celsius just reopened. So what a great time to kind of jump into highlighting female winemakers from really interesting parts of the world.
Love Adele's point about badass winemakers. So yeah, there are several badass winemakers in Armenia. So there's plenty to look at. It's just the issue of whether, you know, what's available here in Houston or in Texas. Everything's available in Washington, in New York, and in LA. LA has them all, but they cannot send them here. We just need distributors here. Anyway,
yeah,
so
I think that's a really good point. And that's something that, you know, when we choose our wines that we want to feature, what can we get enough is always the issue we run into when we're kind of featuring some of these more unique destinations. And it is because stuff just isn't widely available in Houston. But I think that's a really good kind of segue back to the whole wine hunting experience, how these are places where nobody's doing it. Nobody's bringing these wines into Houston yet. Just because they're bringing them into LA or into New York doesn't mean they're here. And there's a market for that. Well, guys, thank you all so much for joining us again this evening. Like I said, next week we're off to Israel and Lebanon. We are so excited to have you guys join us again. And if you have any questions, reach out to me, reach out to Adele. We'll put you in touch with the people who can answer them if we can't answer them ourselves. And we'll see you guys then. Have a good one.
Thank you, Kristen. Is someone feeling a bit needy for mom's attention right now?
Yeah, I know. I could not, my cursor disappeared again.